Great. Well, let's get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this morning and afternoon and evening. We're very excited to share the reducing waste in K through 12 school lunch findings with everyone on this call this morning. This is a collaborative effort coming from WWF's Food Waste Warrior program and researchers from The Ohio State University, the University of Delaware, the University of Maryland, Johns Hopkins University, Bloomberg School of Public Health, and Case Western Reserve University. And of course, none of this would be possible without the Recipes Network, the national science-funded network focused on making our wasteful food system more sustainable, equitable, and resilient. We're excited to embark on this journey today, especially as we're appreciating World Food Day, to talk about insights from two specific collaborations with WWF's Food Waste Warrior team, looking at an analysis of the Food Waste Warriors school food waste database and a sneak peek into an ongoing and very recently just implemented school food waste implementation program where we are studying the implementation of share tables that started just 1 month ago. My name is Mary Jane Chandler, and I am the program associate from World Wildlife Fund's Food Waste Warrior program. To give some background into Food Waste Warriors, it started back in 2018 as an extension of WWF's Wild Classroom Initiative, which is our curriculum development program designed to bring conservation into the classroom. With the same idea in mind, Food Waste Warriors was really launched with this idea of bringing conservation into the classroom, but also wanting to turn the cafeteria into a classroom as well through hands-on and engaging activities for students, all related to teaching them about the food system, talking about topics such as biodiversity, water, and the food system at large and its impact on the environment. And so since the start of 2018, we've really started to work with more than 275 schools all across the US, working with up to 28 states and districts all around. And so we're very excited to be able to share insights that have been contributed, that have come from contributions from schools and educators all across the US, and as well as our nonprofit community partners. And due to their anonymity, we have not listed them all here today, but I would also like to acknowledge our partners, our principals, our kitchen staff, custodial staff, and teachers that we have all worked with in order to be able to share these insights with you all today, and for also allowing us in some cases to go into their cafeterias and honestly make it a little bit messy by leading these food waste audits. We really wouldn't be able to share these insights without them. So just an appreciation for them as well. And with that, I will go into some housekeeping on the next slide. Awesome, thank you. So just some quick notes. Please, I believe that your mics will stay muted for the course of this webinar just to reduce any background noise. But if you are to come off, please just to stay aware of that and to make sure that you do stay on mute. Please put any questions or comments in the Q&A chat filter. This will be on for the course of the webinar, and we please ask that if you also have any technical issues to please use that as well, just so we can help you as much as possible. This meeting will have closed captioning, and it will also be recorded for your awareness, and we will be sure to email that recording to you after the webinar. And with that, I will pass it over to Brian Rowe to introduce himself and the Recipes program.
Hi guys, Brian Rowe from Ohio State University. Glad to be here. We're excited. Part of this is being organized through Recipes. Recipes stands for Resilient, Equitable, and Circular Innovations with Partnerships and Education Synergies. We are a research network funded through the National Science Foundation's Sustainable Regional Systems program. Our team of more than 40 researchers from 15 different institutions, and with, like WWF, very important non-academic partners. We're working across the food system to advance the science needed to make our wasteful food system sustainable, equitable, and resilient. And we do this by integrating across our diverse disciplinary knowledge bases and by interacting with parties within the food system to bring new science to bear upon the problems that cause wasted food throughout the system. And today we're really excited to partner with World Wildlife Fund to think about issues going on in K-12 schools. Here you can see in this slide our vision for our NSF project, thinking about transforming our oftentimes very linearly focused food system that creates waste into a much more circular vision that really embodies prevention, rescue, and valorization. And generally speaking, we are working on several different research questions throughout the network, thinking about causes of wasted food within these food systems, solutions that best address wasted food while focusing on sustainability, equity, and resilience. And then how do we make this process work better by reaching across academics and non-academics alike. The first project that we'll talk about today, and I'll stop sharing so that my co-presenter, Katie Bender from the University of Delaware, can share slides, is a project that came up with discussion through discussion with WWF, Mary Jane, and Alex, and thinking about how we might be able to look at some of those causes, potentially by looking into their great data resources that they have created through the Food Waste Warriors program. And it was through great work of Eunice Ajapong, undergraduate student at the University of Maryland in the Department of Economics, Katie and one of her undergraduate students, Sophia Schaefer, and myself, with great guidance from Alex and Mary Jane and Pete Pearson at WWF to help us navigate the data and undertake the analysis. And I'm going to turn it over to Katie to talk about this really exciting project that we're very happy to share with you today. Take it away, Katie.
Thank you everybody for coming. We're really excited to share this work, and it's been great working with World Wildlife Fund and the other co-authors that we have here. Again, just a shout out to our two undergraduates who helped with analysis, Eunice and Sophia, for all their hard work on this project as well. So let's go ahead and dive into it. So we looking at food waste across K-12 schools. We know that a fair amount of nutrition for primary and secondary school students comes from their food that they're receiving at school. We also know, though, that food waste is a big issue. I think probably most people on this call are on this webinar are familiar with that. And we know that most of this food waste comes at the consumer level. There's been more studies into household level food waste and waste in restaurants than we've seen, though, necessarily in the K-12 space. So overall, there was a national study done in the early 90s that found that about 12% of the calories that were served were wasted. This came partially from students not being hungry, possibly due to the time of their scheduled lunch. Also kids just being picky, maybe with food preferences that didn't necessarily match with the foods that were served. And then with more being served than maybe what that child could eat. We do recognize as well that there may be some amount of food waste that would be acceptable at this elementary level, especially as students maybe try new things, right? And giving them a chance to try these new foods. But overall, we haven't seen a lot of research that's been done at the national level in the US that really looks at food waste within this cafeteria space. So we worked with the World Wildlife Fund on some data that they had collected between 2018 and 2023. There were schools that participated in the World Wildlife Fund's Food Waste Warrior program. And then they self-reported their food waste from meals at their schools several times throughout the semester. We have some schools that reported multiple times. We have some schools that only reported once. And we have a variety of schools, elementary, middle, and high schools, around 130 different unique schools across 24 different states. Overall, we wanted to identify any sort of patterns that we saw within food waste, and maybe start to disentangle what things, what policies and such might help to reduce food waste, and how meal characteristics and such can be designed to minimize the food waste that we see in this space. So overall, what happened was these schools would log into a survey within the World Wildlife Fund site and report whenever they had measured food waste in their cafeteria space. They were asked to break down this food waste into different categories, including the main entree, sides, produce, as well as milk and other sort of liquid waste that they might have. We went ahead and took this measure and this reported measure and turned it into a food waste per student. So they also reported a variety of different meal characteristics, such as when the lunch period was, as well as how many students were served and other characteristics like that, that we'll dive into here in a little bit. So again, we took this and we turned it into how much waste was created per student per meal, and that's the measure that we're going to talk about throughout this presentation. On some of the slides, we have it as ounces per student per meal. Some of them we still have in pounds, but overall the trends are going to be the same. Just to note that in terms of our measurement there. So overall, we can see that elementary school has the highest amount of waste per student. This is in line with the literature that younger students tend to have more waste than older students. Middle and high school students are around the same. And then we did have a handful of schools that we didn't know their level. And so those are included in that right bar there. But again, this is in line with what we see in the literature. Overall, we don't have many observations for the summer. Fall, spring, and winter were when most of our reports were the season for most of our reports. And we don't really notice any major trends here. We did have schools from a variety of regions, Midwest, Northeast, South, and West, but again, no major trends there. The biggest one we first want to talk about is, again, something that has been noted in the literature, which is that students who have a lunch period that's very early in the day tend to waste more. This is likely due to the fact that students just aren't hungry by that point, and so aren't eating as much as a student who is eating later in the day. So we also note this trend where any lunches that start very early, and very early is anything before 11. In our sample, we had no lunch periods that started before 10 a.m., but we did have several lunch periods that were starting right at 10. So anything between 10 and up to 11 was considered very early. And you can see that this is almost 6 ounces of food waste per student. And then this number goes down the later in the day that the lunch period is. So this could be something that is kind of an easy policy implication, right? Maybe trying to aim for having lunch periods that are more set to when students are going to be hungry. And that can be kind of a simple way to reduce some of this food waste. Another really interesting aspect that we were able to analyze is the effect of serving versus offer when students are getting their food. So there's 2 different ways that cafeterias can operate. Everybody is served by a worker, but students can either be served some set food, or they can be asked whether they would like a certain food or not. So they can pick and choose which parts of that meal they may want. So in the offer sense, in the serves, in high school, all students have to have the offer choice. They all have to have a choice. They can decline 1 or 2 of the required food components. They have to have a minimum amount of fruit or veggie as part of their meal in order to qualify as the nutritious meal there. But they can decline parts or substitute out, say, fruit for a vegetable or something like that. So we would expect that at schools that have offer, rather than serving, that there would be less food waste because people can more tailor their meal to what they would like. The students can tailor their meal to what they would like. And we do see at the elementary level that when students are offered, food waste does fall. At the high school, it increases. We're not 100% sure. We need to dive a little bit more into this high school measure because again, all these high schools based off current policies should be offering, although there might be some exceptions, and we may have gotten a few schools that fell under those exceptions. So they are able to not offer, students aren't able to decline any part of the meal. And then in middle school, we also see that those schools that are offering is a little bit higher in terms of food waste than serve, which is a little backwards from what we would expect. Looking at how milk is served is also a very interesting analysis here. So students can either be given a carton of milk or they can choose how much milk they're getting out of some sort of dispenser or just a jug of milk. So when students are able to determine how much they would like, we see that they have a much lower amount of milk waste. That's the blue bar here. And so with this lower level of waste, though, we also see that there's less waste in terms of produce and the entrees and sides. So there may be some other factor at play here. And again, this is where we're going to be diving in a little bit more and doing some regression analysis to try to disentangle some of these effects and see what might be going on if there's some other characteristic of these schools. But for milk, you can see a pretty significant drop here. So again, that might be another easier policy to implement that could greatly reduce this waste per student. We did have some schools that had repeated audits. So these were schools that came back, the same school that came back and reported several times throughout this period. So this graph is showing only the schools that have more than one audit. And there's not necessarily a trend downward. It's not like as these schools are measuring their waste that they are steadily, improving how much they're wasting or essentially decreasing how much they're actually wasting. We do see a little bit of a drop after the second, third audit. So maybe some of that initial measuring is helping schools recognize where they're having waste and changing their behavior a little bit there. We also looked at total food waste by the number of students served. So you can see here that once you have a larger school, over 1,000 students being served in the cafeteria, that these schools tend to have a lot more food waste per student. So this is also true on the other end when you have very few students being served. We did drop a couple of schools that were serving less than 10 students, just since it was kind of an outlier there. But when you have 50 or less students, so between 10 and 50, we see a slightly higher amount of food waste per student. And then again, when you have a lot of students that are being served. So again, that might just come with the more difficulty in managing amounts of food and things like that for such a high number of students, and there being more variability in what those students are, maybe wanting in a day. Part of the Food Waste Warriors program has been certain interventions. And so these interventions we classified under a few different categories. And one of them being a curriculum change. So having actual lesson plans that talked about food waste, and these lesson plans being given to the students. So students seeing this in the classroom. There were also other interventions that were more behavioral in terms of like having a share table or posters in the cafeteria, things like that. And so again, anything that was lesson plans in the classroom, we classified as curricular, and anything otherwise was non-curricular. Some schools, a lot of schools had only one intervention. We did have about 20 or 30 schools, I think, that had multiple interventions. We do see that once this first column here shows schools that had absolutely no interventions, and they do have a higher plate waste overall per student. And then this drops off with those interventions. Now, again, this does not necessarily imply causation. Here we're kind of presenting some of these descriptive statistics. So to be careful in how we interpret this, there could be other characteristics of these schools that are also at play. If they are more willing to implement these interventions, again, it might be kind of a different subset of schools here. But this is promising for the potential impact of World Wildlife Fund's intervention programs. Another thing we looked at was waste by the percentage of students that received free or reduced lunches. So kind of the idea here is that if there's a student who is receiving a free or reduced lunch, then they might be more willing to take, to get more of the food, and then potentially waste that food since they aren't bearing as much of the financial cost. We see in elementary school that as the amount of free and reduced lunches percentage increases, then we do see a bit of increase with this food waste until we get above 75%. So at that point, it does fall. In middle and high schools, again, we see a lower level of plate waste overall. And kind of, again, a little bit opposite here of what we might expect with 20 to 50, when there's 25 to 50% of reduced lunches, that's actually the highest amount of plate waste per student. And then finally, we looked at the amount of waste per by the number of entrees that were offered. So again, here I think that the idea here might be that as there are more options, then students are going to be able to find something that works for them better. We would expect here that as more entrees are offered, we would see less plate waste. It's important to remember that the waste that was being measured here was the waste from the students, the plate waste from the students. So again, what was coming off their plate, not necessarily what was left behind in the cafeteria. So we see here, though, that actually when there are a lot of options, when there's the most number of options, 5 entrees offered, that we actually do see a little bit higher waste. In elementary school, when there's only 1 entree option offered, we also see a fairly high amount of waste overall. So overall, we do have some limitations to this study. We're only capturing schools that have been willing to participate in this program, to measure their food waste, and then to come and actually report that to the World Wildlife Fund. So that is definitely a subset of schools, and we're not really getting a representative sample of schools at the national level. We are unable to assign any sort of causal interpretation here. We haven't had any random assignment to these interventions. So this would be, saying, okay, certain schools are going to implement one type of intervention, maybe that curricular type of intervention, whereas other schools are going to implement maybe a non-curricular, and other schools are just going to measure food waste and have no interventions. It wasn't rolled out like this. Again, all these interventions and this whole program is fully voluntary. So we're unable to really identify any sort of causal effect with this self-reported data in this voluntary program. We also don't necessarily have any pre or post intervention assessments. So we don't see with one school what their food waste was before, say, implementing a curricular intervention, and what their waste is after they do that intervention, if there's some initial decline, and then what the longer term effects are there. So it's just important to recognize that as we look at these results. The other big part is that we don't know anything about how much was actually being served to students. We are only seeing what waste is coming from the students from their plate. We don't know if they are consuming 90% of their meal or if they've consumed 50% of the meal. So that's another, we don't have access to what initially was served, so we can't determine the fraction of food that was wasted. We can only talk about the total amount of food that was wasted from that plate. But overall, I think this does give us some interesting insights. especially with the early lunch periods. With these early lunch periods being associated with higher waste, I think that's something that, is, again, a fairly easy policy, possibly. I'm saying that, but probably somebody scheduling at elementary schools might think different. But something that could greatly reduce this food waste. And also just having milk that is in, students being able to serve milk rather than just giving out jugs of milk, again, leads to less waste. So a few kind of interesting insights. I think that as we do more data analysis and try to disentangle some different effects with our regression analysis, that will also find some more interesting results here. Overall, we do just need to have a deeper assessment to really understand these impacts. Part of this might be doing something more experimental with the rollout of these interventions, possibly. So again, rolling them out in a specific manner so that we can disentangle some of these effects, and then determine what the actual effect of these interventions are. Okay, so that's all I have. Do we want to take questions now, or were we I think we're gonna do a few questions now.
Yeah, I think Valeria, had a question.
I saw a hand, but no.
Yeah, that was Valeria. I think you may be unmuted. If you unmute yourself, Valeria, you should be able to ask the question live.
Yeah, sorry, that was on accident that I raised my hand. Apologies.
Well, now you have to ask. No, just kidding. If there's anybody else that has a question, feel free to raise your hand and we can unmute you. Otherwise, feel free to drop questions into the question and answer box, and we can hand it over to Caitlin.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I will pass it to Mary Jane for a quick intro, and then I'll take it from there. Go ahead, Mary Jane.
Thanks. And thank you, Katie and Brian, for sharing those insights into the Food Waste Warrior database. It's a really great segue into the sneak peek that Caitlin and I will be sharing with you all today around the K-8 share table implementation study that is built out of multiple collaborations between World Wildlife Fund and researchers from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and Case Western Reserve University underneath the Multi-Scale Recipes Network. And yes, thank you, Caitlin. And this is really coming from researchers Caitlin Harper and Ronnie Neff from Johns Hopkins, as well as Melissa Prescott from Case Western Reserve University, who have really been the backbone and foundation for the research element of this study. And then collaborations from myself, Alex Nichols-Vinuesa, and Pete Pearson, members of the Food Loss and Waste team at WWF, who have assisted with school outreach and relationship building to kind of add that additional element to this research study. And next slide. Thank you. And so one of the main questions that we've really received when we've been talking to community partners and schools around this project and why we want to implement this kind of 2-year-long, more involved school food waste research is, well, why are you wanting to do this? And a lot of it has really stemmed from the fact that in past literature, and Katie touched on this as well, most of the research studies have really just focused on the consumption of certain food items in school meals. And they've also been a little bit more kind of short term, from 6 months to 1 year. And so based on that, we've really kind of recognize that more research is needed to, one, assess food waste specifically as an outcome, to evaluate those policy systems and environmental level changes in school systems, which can range from seeing policy changes such as increasing the length of lunchtime, systems level changes around implementing share tables, or environmental level changes around, educational and curriculum. And lastly, determining factors related to the implementation of interventions, rather than just studying kind of the effectiveness of these interventions. We really want to look at how they are implemented in schools in order to create the sustainable and scalable changes. And This project is really unique because it's really stemming from a previous project that started in 2021 from the Food Waste Warriors program, where we launched a 2-year-long project. So it just kind of finished up in June earlier of this year, involving 5 community partners and their associated school districts in Colorado, Illinois, Maryland, Virginia, and Wisconsin. And as Katie also mentioned, this cohort program was really kind of focused on implementing Food Waste Warriors in 3 main steps. One, which was conducting cafeteria food waste audits to get at this idea of managing what we measure. And so as schools were really understanding the layout of their cafeteria school food waste, they were also educating students about food waste in the food system through the Food Waste Warrior curriculum or through other kind of educational activities that were in alignment with that Food Waste Warrior program. And so as kind of both of those things were happening, schools and students and teachers were also really trying to identify certain strategies that could be effective and feasible for their specific school settings that could prevent or reduce food waste. And so WWF has this more in-depth list of evidence-based interventions that can include share tables, bulk milk dispensers, farm to school programming, and a lot of other kind of shown to reduce food waste and prevent food waste from happening strategies that schools can implement. And through that idea of, measuring your food waste and educating students about that, it's really kind of leading up to trying to implement that strategy. And so I will pass it over to Caitlin, but excitingly, and as Caitlin is about to mention, the study that we're doing right now is working with 3 out of those 5 original school partners, including school districts in Illinois, Virginia, and Wisconsin. And with that, I will pass it over to you, Caitlin.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Mary Jane. And again, hi, everyone. My name is Caitlin Harper. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Johns Hopkins working with Ronnie Neff. And super grateful for all of our collaborators, both the researchers and the WWF folks, and also our school partners and our community partners for this study. So as Mary Jane mentioned, this study is really coming as Food Waste Warriors was coming to a close, right? And we were kind of like, what can we do next with the knowledge that we gained, that WWF gained from Food Waste Warriors? And so our goal for this study was to look at the implementation and impact of food waste interventions in 12 schools, K through 8, across 4 unique sites. So we have partners that were part of the Food Waste Warrior program in a large urban district in Illinois, a smaller urban district in Wisconsin, a smaller rural district in Virginia, and then we also added a medium urban district in, should say Maryland. So our specific aims for this study are, 1, to assess the effectiveness of food waste interventions in K-12 public schools, to identify and describe the strategies used to implement food waste reduction interventions, and to identify and describe key contextual factors that influence intervention effectiveness and implementation. So really building off what Mary Jane said, we are looking at 2 aspects here. We are looking at the effectiveness aspect of it, of the intervention itself, and we are also looking at the implementation. And I will say, actually, the implementation piece is the largest piece of this. Effectiveness kind of fits in those frameworks, and so that's why we're using it. But really, our focus is on implementation. And I think the reason, Katie really highlighted it in her presentation, there are a lot of really great opportunities for reducing food waste in schools, things like pushing the timing of lunch to be later, doing offer versus serve, implementing bulk milk dispensers. But our question is like, what does it take to actually do those things? How come schools aren't doing them? And how can we push schools in that direction now that we have some data that supports these effective interventions? So again, in Illinois, Wisconsin, Virginia, and Maryland, we are implementing interventions, and we asked each of our school districts and if there's a community partner in the area to help us identify, based on the list that Mary Jane was talking about, which intervention they wanted to test out in their district. So in Illinois, we don't have a community partner, but we are working with the school district's food nutrition services, and they chose share tables as their intervention. In Wisconsin, we do have a community partner, Sustain Dane, and they also chose share tables, and that was a decision made in collaboration between Sustain Dane and the school district. In Virginia, we have a community partner, Boxerwood Education Association, and they already, in the school district we're working in, which was a partner of Food Waste Warriors, they actually already had share tables implemented. And so while we wanted to keep the intervention consistent throughout all 4 of the sites, it actually didn't make sense because they already had one. And so they chose composting with an educational component. And then in Maryland, the 4th site that we added, we also don't have a community partner, but we're working closely with their FNS and their sustainability team, and they also chose share tables as their interventions. So for data collection, one of the things we're doing for effectiveness is doing food waste audits and also observations, environmental observations at the same time. And so this fall, as Mary Jane said, we just launched this a month ago. And so we've been doing pilot food waste audits in all 4 of our sites. And so we're really doing 1 pilot audit and 2 baseline audits this fall. And then in January, all of the sites will implement their interventions. They'll begin their interventions. And for the next year and a half after that, so spring 2024 to spring 2025, we will do 6 post-intervention food waste audits to understand how the interventions worked. So I'll show you a couple pictures because it's very exciting that we did our pilot audits. So you can see here, this is some pictures from our various sites. So we have our buckets with the main dish. We have main dish 2, if they have 2 main dishes, like a chicken patty and a PB&J, we'll separate those. We have vegetables, we have fruit. We are saving whole fruit. So if kids don't actually take a bite out of it and it's not cut into, we can put it in the whole fruit basket. We have flavored milk, and the one on the end here is white milk. And so you can see these are labeled differently in different sites, but it's pretty much the same. And we are using these suitcase scales to measure the buckets, measure the waste. A couple more pictures, again, just showing you kind of the process. What you're missing out on here, I'm sure many of us have been in school cafeterias, but what you're missing out on here is the chaos of the situation of kids coming up and trying to throw things away and us snagging it and saving it. And so obviously we're not capturing any of the kids in our photos, but hopefully some of these photos will show you a bit about the complexity of doing these food waste audits. So to capture the information from the food waste audits, we are using a few different forms. Down here, we have the reference weights. So we are going to, for every entree and every item that kids receive, we will we'll weigh them 5 different times and take the average weight so that we know, if we have a 40-pound bucket of sloppy joes, how many whole sloppy joes is in that bucket. And we also do that for the inedible portion. So we do it for the apple cores and the orange peels, and the banana peels, so that when we go to this and we are weighing our buckets, we'll weigh like the fruit bucket, and then we'll count how many cores are in there, how many peels are in there, and we'll subtract that weight from there. And then finally, I noticed, or I said that we were going to save the whole fruit, but we also save, the unopened milks that we have, or unopened cheese sticks that we have, things like that. And we'll tally those up. And since we have the reference weights, we'll be able to calculate the weight of those items and how much would be wasted if we weren't saving those. And kind of the reason we're doing that is, 1 is because we want to see what kinds of foods would go onto the share table, but 2, it really breaks our heart to see all of the different foods that are unopened that would just go in the trash. And so we have found different ways to get rid of those, whether that's putting them out at the end of the day for parents to pick up as they're picking up their kids, or taking them to a local food pantry or church. So we're kind of getting rid of that food so we don't have to put it in the landfill. The other piece of this is every time we do an audit, we'll also do an observation of the environment, the cafeteria environment. So we have a few different ways that we're doing this, but we are looking at, the space distribution. How big is the cafeteria? How many tables does it have? Does it have signage? We're looking at the regular process for how kids normally dispose of their trays and food. We're looking at water availability. One of the things that Katie mentioned, was that cafeterias that serve a large amount of students have much higher waste. And so hopefully these observations will give a little bit of insight into why this might be happening. So we're looking at also things like how long kids stand in line, how long they're actually at their seat before they're asked to dispose of their trays, how busy the cafeteria is, other environmental factors like that. So we'll be doing that every single time we go in for a food waste audit. The other aspect of this is, I talked about implementation. And so we are using, we will do in-depth interviews with each of either our school district partners who are helping us implement this, or with our community partners, and try to understand, what does it actually take to implement interventions in schools? Because our community partners have long-standing relationships and have worked in schools for a number of years. So to do this, we're adapting the expert recommendations for implementing change, or the ERIC framework. And this has been adapted for schools into the framework that's called the School Implementation Strategies, translating ERIC resources, or the sister strategies. So this framework has been used in some studies in schools, primarily around implementation of strategies used in school-based mental health interventions, but it has never been used to look at interventions in the cafeteria, whether that's nutrition-based or school food waste. We know that since schools and school districts are really complex systems with very limited capacity for change. I was laughing, Katie, when you were like, yeah, it seems like an easy intervention. It does from the outside. I think all of us are like, yeah, it seems like we can just push the lunches back. But I'm curious to find out, because I don't know even, what types of factors are involved in making those types of changes. So I'm excited to understand more about that. And then, of course, we are also doing interviews with key school personnel. So even within the schools that we don't have partners, we'll be talking to FNS and the sustainability teams, but really it's the people who are on the ground doing the work every single day whose input we also need to keep in mind. So this is things like the cafeteria staff. This is things like the principals or the champion teachers who are really pushing to reduce food waste in their schools. And so we'll identify 4 to 5 individuals per district to talk to really about the intervention, how it went, what it took to implement it, the contextual factors, the barriers and facilitators to implementing the intervention, and then also bringing up some of these other intervention ideas that maybe the school districts didn't choose, and asking them, why is this feasible or unfeasible in your district and in your school? And for this, we'll be using the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, or the CFIR framework. So with that, I will wrap up, because we are in the very beginning stages. And so I am very excited in the next year and 2 years to really share the results with you after we've collected more data. But if you have any questions or any comments, please feel free to reach out to me. My email address is here on the screen. And I think I'm turning it back over to Mary Jane.
Sure. Thank you so much, Caitlin, for going over that really exciting study. And I will open it up if there are any questions. I see there is a comment in the chat, and thank you for, would it be helpful to update this enabling shared tables in the National School Lunch Program? I think that would be amazing if we had the opportunity to collaborate with the National School Lunch Program and provide updates to legal review and best management practices. But it's something that we haven't quite yet talked about as a team, but I really appreciate that shout out. So thank you for putting that in the chat box. And if there are any other questions related to the study that Caitlin just went over, as well as Katie and Brian's review of the Food Waste Warrior database, please raise your hand or use the Q&A box to share any insights, feedback, questions. Happy to answer them.
Mary Jane, do you see the new question? Maybe Caitlin. Any schools express interest in how waste reduction practices can influence their budgets? Caitlin, I don't know if any of your partners or Jane talked about
Sorry,
that.
I don't see where this question is. Can you say it one more time?
It's in the Q&A. Have any schools expressed interest in how waste reduction practices can influence their budgets positively?
Can help to answer that first, Caitlin, and then if you have any comments, jump in after that. I will definitely say yes. I think a lot of the times when we're talking to schools or even to community partners, one way that they're really interested in doing food waste reduction work and implementing strategies is because from the school district side, or even from, you know, kitchen staff and custodial staff, they really want to be able to see like how much they're saving when it comes to hauling services, how many times they're having to take the trash out, because food is really heavy and it's really messy. And I think Caitlin can truly attest to this from doing the pilot audits. We've seen how much is kind of going into these different bins. And even through carton recycling programs, we've seen to really reduce the amount of just like air and space that's filling up these trash bins. So it makes the lift a little bit easier on custodial staff and kitchen staff. So there's cost savings there. And I would also say it kind of depends on the intervention that you may be doing. Sometimes we've seen cost savings when it comes to energy reduction. If you're doing bulk milk dispensers, and the cooling practices of those milk cartons can reduce energy costs that way. So yes, if this is something that is even interested to you, I would be more than happy to talk to you about that one-to-one. But I would say, yeah, having those kind of like cost and resource savings is a big kind of motivating factor for schools to work on food waste reduction strategies. And I saw some other questions, but I'm not sure if I think Caitlin might have gotten to them in the chat.
As Valerie asked, has training of school personnel been tested as an intervention versus putting the effort on the students? And I know I've seen one or two studies in the literature, at least like this, but Caitlin and Mary Jane, do you have any direct examples?
I do know that there has been some training tested of school personnel in terms of back of house waste, but in our study specifically, we're really looking at, you know, back of house in the back of the kitchen, but we're really looking at front of house. And so that is more student facing. But I don't know, Mary Jane, are you familiar? I think this has been effective in like reducing waste back of house.
Yeah, and I don't think I haven't seen any specific studies that have like truly gone through this kind of same process of measuring this like pre and post like waste that we are doing with this one. But I do know that it is of interest, and different school districts are trying out this piece, especially when it comes to share tables. We have some partners that are doing trainings around share tables for the back of house in particular. So they can know like how much to put out and how much not to put out, just so it helps to kind of reduce the amount that they're kind of like putting on the line in general. I'm not sure if it has shown to reduce waste or not. I think that finding isn't necessarily out there yet. But then also I think trainings around offer versus serve, as Katie and Brian kind of mentioned, and their study, doing trainings to kitchen staff around that. We have kind of seen that it could reduce food waste, but again, haven't like specifically studied it for the back of house specifically to like know how much is happening, and what all goes into that. And yeah, kind of like those factors to really actually reduce that food waste.
Mary Jane, I'll say there's one study in Europe where I remember them training teachers to be a better precept about not wasting food and seeing if that affected children's waste. So I'll try to do a deep dive here quick and see if I can find that site and drop it in the chat for people as well.
So yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
There was another question from the box here. How do you define share tables? How do they work in your case? Melissa, I'll come back to your question after that.
Yeah. So each of the districts that we're working with is going to come up with they have their own SOP that they're going to be using. And we have kind of been working with them to figure this out. But I mean, so a share table, the definition, the broad definition, which I should have said earlier, is when, kids come out and they have food that's been unopened and they don't want those foods, they can put it on the share table, and then anyone else can come and grab those foods and take them and eat them during that lunch period. And schools, sometimes, not the schools in our district, but schools sometimes also do this with breakfast items. So they'll keep breakfast items out and kids can pick them up at lunch. And it spans multiple lunch periods as well. So the younger kids could put things, and this is true for our partners in Virginia, is that the younger kids often put things on the share table, and then later in the day, the older kids pick things up from the share table. Yeah, and so some districts are more open to the idea of milk, and Katie talked a lot about milk waste. And so some districts are more into that, but they have to have a place to keep it cold, and other cold items, they would have to have a place to keep it cold. But this share tables don't include anything that's been opened or any of the entrees that, are just like served in a dish or anything like that for food safety reasons.
And then Melissa's question was, WWF did a great economic impact report on the business case for reducing school food waste. So that's shared in the Q&A box. Thank you, Melissa. Let's see. One other question I thought it was, maybe it just disappeared on me here. No, that one slipped away from me. Sorry about that, guys. Thought there's another question there in the box.
Thank you, everyone, for your questions. It's really great to talk through this, and I appreciate everyone's insights and comments as well.
And a couple other questions just popped up here. Waste audits are great for research. Once the research phase is over, would you recommend a waste audit on an annual basis or not?
That's a really, really good question. Ideally, yes. And I think part of this is part of the study we have been learning is that school districts want to measure their waste, and food waste audits are kind of an easier lift, opposed to, doing it, weighing it through their dumpsters or things like that. And a lot of school districts don't have the capacity to do it. And so I think part of the implementation, learning about that, can also be learning about what it takes to implement food waste audits for schools. I know specifically our partners in Maryland really want to do this for every single school in the entire state. And school districts are like, whoa, don't put that on us just quite yet. And so we're hoping that some of the findings from this study will be able to help schools that want to be doing that.
Valerie had another great question. Has there been knowledge sharing between restaurants and schools on this topic? I haven't seen much in the literature that I'm familiar with. In fact, there's very few studies that simultaneously look at back of house and front of house, either in school settings or in restaurant settings. They're almost each treated as their own separate universe. I think Melissa Prescott has been on one paper that looks at both back of house and front of house, but it's a very small sample, sadly, out of Colorado. So a lot more scope for this. Mary Jane, Caitlin, maybe you guys know, because WWF has done great work with restaurants and food service and hoteliering. Has there been much crosstalk?
I have seen, yeah. Unfortunately, I think it would be really interesting to dive more into that. So I really appreciate that question. I will say that kind of in the same vein, the latest Food Donation Improvement Act that was passed last year, which is designed to really help schools donate their kind of leftover hot food at the end of the school lunch to food banks or just other kind of like food donation centers that are taking in food. It's this new act was designed to make that lift a little bit easier for schools and to take some of kind of the barriers off of them when it comes to food safety or the concerns that they may experience. And so that is the closest thing I may see in terms of a crossover when it comes to, instead of having to throw that hot lunch away at the end of the school day because they're not able to reuse that, instead being able to donate and set up a system that's a lot more smoother and more effective from schools to another kind of entity. Food donation wise, but that is a great question.
Valeria follows up with, the ordering challenge is particularly keen, and that leads me to think that maybe the breakthroughs might come at the university cafeteria level, because I know we've had some interesting changes in the way that students can order food post-COVID, and one wonders that is kind of a merger of where the Sodexos and food service folks of the world and educational institutions come together. And so maybe we'll see some spillover to the K-12 space on that front, although I still haven't seen research at the university level really doing what Valeria had mentioned either. So who knows? Great fodder for future research. A lot of innovative software available now, says Valeria, to grocery stores and restaurants to manage inventory better. Maybe one day for schools, agreed. Yeah. I think we're getting close to both the end of time and maybe the end of questions. So with that, Mary Jane, Katie, Caitlin, anything else people like to share before we sign off? Thanks to our closed caption provider today, and to Rachel Weiss for helping, and Miles Baker from OSU and Rachel Weiss from Recipes for helping set up the webinar today. We appreciate it much. We will hopefully get this posted and be available both at Food Waste Collaborative site here at Ohio State University and at the Recipes website at American University. So if people want to share this later on with people, feel free to send those links, and we'll respond to everybody who registered with those links as well. Awesome. Thanks. Have a great rest of your World Food Day.
Thanks, everyone.
Everyone.